We ready?
I'm ready.
Greetings and welcome to Ill Repute, the podcast about women and women first. I'm Sovereign Sire, a writer, comedian, and the proud descendant of a woman that was tried for witchcraft in the 1600s, named Sarah.
Wow, that's really fucking cool. I did not know that. I'm Ella Darling, a VR pioneer, a former librarian, an adult film performer, still kind of a little bit, and the owner of many skulls. There's a small selection behind me, some real, some not, but it does extend down the entire wall beside me, which is the witchiest thing, one of the witchiest things about my home, at least.
Yeah.
I don't know, there's a lot of contenders.
It's pretty witchy.
So, here at Ill Repute, we support women's rights, but more importantly, we support women's wrongs.
That is correct. And what woman's wrongs are we righting today?
Our witchy bitches.
I actually thought about titling this episode Witches Be Crazy, but I didn't want to be too flippant because we are going to be talking about like a massive femicide event. So yeah.
That was good judgment.
Tell me before we start, like, do you know very much about the witch hunts?
I know what I studied in high school for the most part. From what I understand, it could have been mass hysteria. It could have been some mycological thing making people a little out of touch with reality. It could have been violence against women. The way that women aggress violently against women isn't usually coming to blows. It's usually using your words. And
right.
A lot of young women made accusations that resulted in deaths of people. Burnings, drownings. That's all I got. Yeah.
So, not a lot.
Oh, also, Salem, Massachusetts is like a femicide tourist destination. If you can think of the Disney version of lots of women dying, that's Salem. And it's very kitschy. It's fun, but it's still like something. Tell me everything I don't know because it could fill rooms.
So what most people don't know is that very brief period in Salem was kind of like a fart in the wind of the witch hunts. The European witch hunts actually took place over the span of like a couple hundred years, and hundreds of thousands of women and men and children were executed for being witches all across Europe. Like it was a massive femicide event. Salem was like I said, it was a fart in the wind of the actual witch hunts. And so what we're going to be discussing today specifically is why they happened. And because to really understand why they happened, you have to understand kind of the other huge paradigm shift that was happening in society, which was the transfer from feudalism to capitalism. And that ties in very explicitly to the witch hunts. This is a theory that is propagated in the book called Caliban and the Witch, which is considered quite a seminal work.
Yes.
There's a previous episode of this that people can reference if they would like to, in which I interviewed Dr. Heather Berg specifically about the contents that we're going to be discussing today and next week. So if you want ancillary content, you want more, then you can go reference that old episode where I went to her office and we kind of had we had a breakout sesh about specifically Caliban and the Witch. But we're relying heavily on that. And also we're going to be looking at a book called Witchcraft, Lycanthropy, Drugs, and Disease, an anthropological study of witch hunts. And this podcast is also quite influenced by the thinking of Michel Foucault and his book Discipline and Punishment, which was about the penal system and how the body politic is all informed, like if the move from torture to imprisonment to rehabilitation, how that happened. All of these things are very thick hard, scholarly books. So we're going to do the best we can I'm going to do the best I can to ease y'all in, because when I think of books that really changed the way I look at the state, the way I look at power struggles, the way I look at any kind of political conflict, the other thing that really drastically changed it was probably the documentary Century of the South by Adam Curtis. Like I can pick out the like Conscientious Objections by Neil Postman. I can pick out like specific works that fundamentally changed the way that I see the world and the way I understand how all of these state apparatuses work together to accomplish goals socially.
The European Witch Craze, also known as the witch hunts or the witch trials, was a period of intense persecution of individuals accused of witchcraft in Europe from the late 15th century to the 18th century. It was characterized by a widespread belief in the existence of witches and their association with malevolent supernatural powers. Thousands of people, primarily women, were accused, arrested, tried, and often executed as witches during this time.
The witch hunts were rooted in the belief that certain individuals, witches, had made pacts with the devil or evil spirits. They were believed to possess supernatural powers, including the ability to harm others, fly, shapeshift, and cast spells. Witchcraft was seen as a grave threat to society and Christianity.
The witch hunts occurred during a period of social, religious, and political upheaval in Europe. Factors contributing to the witch craze included religious tensions, the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, economic instability, misogyny, fear of social disruption, and the influence of publications like the Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, a witch-hunting manual. Accusations of witchcraft were often based on flimsy or hearsay evidence. Accused individuals, primarily women, were subjected to torture to extract confessions. Accusations sometimes arose from personal vendettas, neighborly disputes, or economic jealousy.
Many accused witches were subjected to brutal torture to obtain confessions, which were often used as the primary evidence in trials. Common forms of torture included the rack, thumbscrews, and waterboarding. Trials were often biased and followed a script that assumed guilt. Convicted witches faced various forms of execution, including hanging, burning at the stake, and drowning. The severity of punishment varied by region and over time, but many innocent individuals suffered gruesome deaths. Tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were accused and killed during this period.
Now, this didn't happen in a vacuum, so it's important to paint a picture of what Europe was like in the years leading up to the outbreak of the plague. Europe was predominantly organized under a feudal system, with a hierarchical structure of land ownership. Kings and monarchs ruled over nobility and clergy, who in turn granted land to vassals, lords, in exchange for loyalty.
The manor was the basic economic unit of medieval life. It consisted of a lord's estate, villages, and farmlands worked by peasants. The lord provided protection, and in return, peasants provided labor, crops, and other produce. The majority of the European population lived in rural areas and were engaged in agriculture. Life was centered around the cycles of planting and harvesting.
The dominant religion was Roman Catholicism, and the church played a central role in daily life. Religious rituals and practices were deeply integrated into society, and the church was a powerful political and spiritual authority. There was a strong emphasis on religious piety and the fear of God. People believed in the afterlife and the importance of salvation. The church had a significant influence on moral and ethical standards. The medieval calendar was filled with religious festivals and holidays, which punctuated the year with celebrations and rituals.
So Europe was divided into numerous feudal states, kingdoms, and principalities, often engaged in conflicts and rivalries. Political power was decentralized, and there was no unified European authority. The 100 Years' War between England and France was ongoing, creating a state of conflict and instability in parts of Europe.
The era saw the rise of medieval universities, such as the University of Bologna, University of Paris, and University of Oxford. These institutions were centers of learning and the transmission of knowledge, and probably some other things.
Mm-hmm.
While Europe was primarily rural, there was a slow growth of towns and cities. These urban centers were hubs of trade, commerce, and culture. Towns had a guild system that regulated trade and craftsmanship. Guilds were important social and economic institutions. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, and healthcare was often based on traditional remedies and superstitions. Sanitation was inadequate in many areas, leading to unsanitary conditions that contributed to the spread of diseases. My definition of inadequate unsanitary conditions is probably not theirs, so I'm horrified to even imagine.
Yeah. I mean, it took them a long time to figure out you shouldn't like dig a latrine next to a well.
Right.
Because the groundwater could be contaminated, like, you know, the groundwater, like.
Yeah.
Yeah, it took, because they didn't have germ theory yet. So it's like,
right.
You know, there just wasn't.
Was it still the humoral theory back then?
Yeah, I think the four humors.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they weren't necessarily wrong. I think if you think of the humors as like hormones, like there's actually a lot of accuracy to that. And so the body is ruled by these chemicals that the brain produces, and they influence your personality and your presentation. So, you know, like I'm kind of lenient on ancient medicine. I'm not
going to criticize the theory. I'm just saying the practice, like you have to walk before you can run. You have to know the language before you use poetic license.
Yeah.
That's where I come.
Yeah. I don't expect y'all to have a passing knowledge of feudalism. I didn't. So I'm going to break down for you sort of what feudalism was, so we can appreciate what a sea change capitalism is when it came into town. Like when it rode into town on a dark horse. Okay. So at this time, land was the primary source of wealth and power. Owning land and producing product from that land. Okay. So that's huge, because that is not how it is today. Yes. Like, right. So the main way that you generated wealth and therefore power was from land ownership. Vassals, lords, in turn could have their own vassals. And the system continued on down the hierarchy.
So it's like you're subleasing and subleasing and subleasing.
Yeah, like kings, like, you did so great. I'm going to give you this region over here. I'm going to give you Bologna, okay?
Okay.
All right, and you're like, oh, bet. Okay, I need to work that land. Okay, let me get some peasants, and in exchange for me, like, protecting them and taking care of them, they have to come work my land for me. And then on and on and on. They might, right, okay.
Right. It's like an MLM.
You know? Yeah. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Or girl bossing.
Yeah. So vassals were bound by oaths of fealty to their lords and were required to provide military service, financial support, and other services when called upon. These obligations were typically outlined in formal agreements known as feudal contracts or charters. So it's like a mission statement. Like, I agree to do XYZ for you in exchange for maintaining this land. Right. And on down the line. So
feudal Europe lacked a strong centralized authority, and governance was decentralized. Kings and monarchs had limited power, and much of the day-to-day administration and justice were handled at the local level by lords. Feudal society was characterized by social hierarchy, but there was some potential for social mobility. In exceptional cases, peasants could become vassals or rise in status through military service or other means.
This also encouraged people to be brave soldiers, because if you could get distinguished in battle, you might get gifts, you might get favor, etc. So it did allow for, yes. So how did this system come to be? Let's go back a little further, because, you know, I'm going to make you fucking do that.
Oh, of course.
Okay. Feudalism had serfs. All right. This is sort of serfdom. So serfdom developed in Europe during the 5th through the 7th centuries, when the slave system started to break down. So before we had this, we had a slave system. So the Roman Empire had been built on slave labor, but by the 4th century, in the Roman territories and the new Germanic countries, landlords had to grant their slaves the right to have a plot of land and a family of their own in order to put down slave rebellions. So essentially, the empire got too wide, it got too big, it got too whatever, and this allowed slaves to come together and revolt. And so they had to figure out a way to change the system to keep that from happening.
To keep them passive enough and comfortable enough to not be in a position where they actually might overthrow them.
Yes. So slaves would run off into the bush and they would form maroon colonies of ex-slaves. And these people would go in and raid places. I mean, these were like dangerous people. It's sort of like they would just go form a gang and be like, all right, like we're going to rob people on the road. We're going to loot people's houses. Like, I mean, it was, you know, you need to figure out a way to handle this problem, right?
Right.
There is such a thing as like you can get just too big, you know? I miss him. Anyway, okay. At the same time, landowners also began to subjugate the free peasants who were unable to keep up with slave labor, so had to indenture themselves to landlords like slaves. And this created a homogenized class of workers called serfs. So basically, if someone had all this slave labor and then you were a free agent and you wanted to be hired on to go work someone's place, like you couldn't compete with free.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
So it's like you'd have to like basically indenture yourself. So now you had an even larger group of people that all had the same collective interest. Right. So, and they're called serfs. You've got your lords and you've got your serfs.
Okay. Perfect. While these working conditions were a burden to workers, they had also vastly improved, with no more gang labor and less severe punishments. The lord of the land was still the judicial authority, but judgments were based on customary agreements and even jury trials. The largest benefit was being able to own land that they could pass down to children. Because they could sustain themselves, they couldn't be forced to do things out of fear of starvation, which enabled them to organize against lords for better treatment and more rights. A serf could be kicked off the land, but this was rarely done, as it would be hard to find replacement labor given the organized nature of peasant struggles. They still had to attend the lord's land, but they got to decide how to go about doing that while maintaining their own homesteads.
So you see that basically it was like this trickle down, like we have to give them a little bit. We have to give them a little bit of land, i.e. wealth, for them to be invested in order for them to continue to work for us. Like we have to have this concession. We have to give them a little bit of our wealth,
right,
in exchange for their labor. And so we talk about like union strong. From the beginning of time, like work and labor actions are the only thing that has created better conditions for everyone.
Yes.
So like we're talking, this is 4th, 8th century. And then we get this new system. Like, so pretty quickly.
Unions work.
Yeah, they work. This is not to say that peasants were an egalitarian community. There were still social differences between slaves and free laborers, and those that were tied to the land and those that weren't. Women didn't own land unless they inherited it, which some did. But by all accounts, they were second-class citizens. They weren't appointed to offices or given authority. However, they were still less differentiated from their male counterparts than free women would later be under capitalism. This was because their husband's or father's authority was the authority of the lords. A passage from Caliban and the Witch.
Quote, "Furthermore, since work on the Seville farm was organized on a subsistence basis, the sexual division of labor in it was less pronounced and less discriminating than on a capitalist farm. In the feudal village, no social separation existed between the production of goods and the reproduction of the workforce. All work contributed to the family's sustenance. Women worked in the fields in addition to raising children, cooking, washing, spinning, and keeping an herb garden. Their domestic activities were not devalued and did not involve different social relations from those of men, as they would later in a money economy when housework would cease to be viewed as real work."
So basically, because it was a sustenance situation, whether you were nursing a baby or you were plowing a field, it was all necessary to survive. Therefore, it was valued with equal weight.
Wow, what an incredible concept.
Isn't it just? Okay, so continuing from Caliban and the Witch. If we also take into account that in medieval society, collective relations prevailed over familial ones, and most of the tasks that female serfs performed were done in cooperation with other women, we then realize that the sexual division of labor, far from being a source of isolation, was a source of power and protection for women. So basically, you would be doing work with other women, Like you weren't isolated doing women's work in the house, like because women did all work. So women worked together. So there was more time to socialize and create community, which is what women, I will say that I will concede this biologically. Women just tend to be community builders. I don't know if they're more nurturing or motherly. That I don't know. But it does seem like a common thread through history is that women are just the community builders. I don't know. Like, and you'll see it as this goes on. Like, it's just kind of something that's always been there.
It's also, it makes sense that women are working with other women because they have a lot they can relate to each other on. There's passing of information and knowledge when you're in a shared space like that. There's health information. There's, I mean, you and I have our huddles, right?
Yeah.
Where I learn a lot about life from you and we communicate our struggles and we kind of advise each other, and having that community makes everyone stronger because that's a lot of different families that are now bonded through that. And it is really, it's heartbreaking to see how that went from something that was valued, that was such an important part of the community, to something that is seen as worthless almost today in households.
And also that that patriarchy is very invested in women competing with each other.
Yes.
And we'll get in. You'll see why. You will see why. So Caliban and the Witch, it goes on. This was the basis for an intense female sociality and solidarity that enabled women to stand up to men. Despite the fact that the church preached women's submission to men and canonic law sanctified the husband's right to beat his wife.
Okay, you just answered it.
Yeah. So by having that community solidarity with other women, they could collectively create a resistance when someone stepped out of line.
So the obvious solution is to isolate, breed rivalry.
Yeah.
Through the 13th and 14th century, tensions between serfs and their lords ramped up. Conflicts could be armed, or they would use strikes or weaponized incompetence. The goal of the serfs was to hold onto their surplus labor and to expand their economic and judicial rights. They would avoid baking their bread or grinding their grain in the lord's facility to avoid taxes. Especially, they would fight the corvée, or required work they were summoned to do on their lord's land. If they felt the ask was too much, they would refuse to go or do the work badly, creating frequent legal battles between lords and serfs. They also objected to being conscripted to fight in their lord's battles. In 1300, one lord had recruited 16,000 peasants, and within a few months, only 3,000 remained. The serfs were a force to be contended with.
The biggest point of contention were the taxes, and they were endless and arbitrary. We will read through what, these are ridiculous. Peasants were required to pay rent or taxes to their lords in exchange for the use of land on the lord's estate. This was typically paid in the form of agricultural produce, such as grain, livestock, or a percentage of their crops. The specific terms of rent and the amount varied depending on the manorial agreement. Basically, you get this section of land and this is yours, but it's not like you're renting.
It's like you're a franchisee. You keep a percentage, but
Yes. Tithe was a church tax that required peasants to contribute a portion, usually 1/10, of their agricultural produce or income to the local parish church. The tithe supported the clergy and the maintenance of the church. And I think this one was people what probably had the least problem with, because a lot of times the only people that could read or write were the village priests. And because they did the ceremonies and they were a huge part of regulating social life. So I think this is the one that still people still do this today. Right. It's probably the one that was least objectionable because it had the direct social benefit.
Peasants were often obligated to provide labor services to their lords or the manor. This could include working on the lord's land, repairing roads, bridges, and other infrastructure, and performing other manual tasks as required by the lord. When a serf or peasant died, the lord had the right to claim the best or most valuable piece of the deceased's property as a heriot. This was intended to be a form of inheritance tax. That's pretty fucked.
Yeah.
Relief was a one-time payment made by a peasant to the lord when he or she inherited land or entered into a new manorial agreement. It was often a significant financial burden on the peasant.
The rent's too goddamn high. In some regions, lords imposed a tax on peasants who wished to marry or transfer their land or property. This was known as a merchet, and it was paid to the lord as a fee for granting permission for such transactions. While not always a direct tax, some feudal lords required peasants to provide military service or military equipment in times of war. In lieu of military service, lords might collect a scutage, a fee paid by the vassal to avoid military duty. In areas with extensive forests, peasants might be subject to forest laws and taxes. They could be required to pay fees for grazing livestock, collecting firewood, or using forest resources.
Wow.
Yeah. It's like vacationing in Hawaii.
Seriously? Oh
yeah.
my God.
It's like buying a beer in Paris. Like, hey.
The biggest change was the commutation of labor services to money payments. Peasants would tend their land and then pay part of their profits to the lords. The lords would hire the peasants to do work rather than exchanging labor for property. This pretty much ended serfdom, but created the first refugees of capitalism. While a wealthy peasant with lots of land could pay the lord and hire other peasants to work their land, most peasants only had a few acres with which they could barely sustain themselves. These peasants would end up hiring themselves out to other peasants to work and would have to rely on charity to get by.
So basically, serfs had kind of created these conditions for themselves. And then that created a new kind of economy where, like, when that reached its limit, then they start playing the game. And they're like, well, I'll just pay you money and then I'll have them do it. And then, so now we're moving away from sustenance existence because as certain peasants started to accumulate wealth, i.e. land, right? Like that starts to be more land than they can work. So then they need to like hire someone to, right?
Right.
Because the accumulation of the land had ceased to be about sustenance. It had now expanded to, because everyone wants to expand and increase, right? That's the human condition, I guess.
Yeah. And upward mobility can really destroy the way that you treat other people when you're moving into a position of power from nothing.
So this commutation of labor services to money payments also made it hard for a laborer to distinguish between the labor they did for themselves and for the lords, and put them in a position to exploit other workers who weren't as well off. The first wave of capitalism immediately created a class of poor people that couldn't survive without periodic charity. It also created division among the peasantry instead of being a united group of workers where income differences became class differences.
It was at this time that the Jews were also singled out for devaluation. Christians took over money lending, one of the few occupations Jews could have. This reduced them to money lending on the village level, where indebted peasants came to view them as the enemy. Women also lost out due to these changes because access to property and income was reduced by them. They could no longer inherit a third of their husband's property, and in rural areas, they were unable to own land if single or widowed. So in the 13th century, there was a large movement of women into cities, and by the 15th century, women made up a large percentage of the population in cities.
So again, I'm going to read from Caliban and the Witch. Here, most of them lived in poor conditions, holding low-paid jobs as maids, hucksters, retail traders, spinsters, members of the lower guild, and sex workers. However, living in the urban centers, among the most combative part of the medieval population, gave them a new social autonomy. City laws do not free women. Few could afford the quote-unquote city freedom, as the privileges connected with city life were called. But in the city, women's subordination to male tutelage was reduced, as they could now live alone or with their children as heads of families, or could form new communities, often sharing their dwellings with other women. Living in cities, women engaged in male trades, from smiths and butchers to midwives, surgeons, and doctors. They also became involved in the heretic movement, unquote.
Heretic sects began to spring up, influenced by Eastern religions brought to Europe by merchants. Heretic sects were a protest religion. It denounced social hierarchies, property ownership, and wealth accumulation. At the root of heretic sects was the corruption of the clergy. The church was seen as a corrupt institution concerned only with money accumulation. This was a result of selling absolutions and indulgences, and local clerics charging for everything from burials to christenings. Most heretics believed in poverty and the return to primitive rural life. They abhorred war and practiced religious tolerance, allowing Jews to live among them. And just real quick, selling absolutions and indulgences. Do you want to just kind of recap what that means?
So basically, if you sinned, you could pay the priest and they would absolve you of the sin, or they would let you pay for the indulgence. So basically, morality was something that was rigid for the poor and flexible for the wealthy.
It's like a carbon tax.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
They also believed in celibacy, not for puritanical reasons, but out of the belief that more slaves should not be made for the oppressor. They didn't preach abstinence per se, though. Children were an expense, and most peasants delayed children by delaying marriage. The heretical sects can be seen as also practicing birth control in this way. Another quote from Caliban and the Witch. This would explain why, when population growth became a major social concern at a time of severe demographic crisis and labor shortage in the late 14th century, heresy became associated with reproductive crimes, especially sodomy, infanticide, and abortion.
In heretical sects, women could preach, live with men out of wedlock, and otherwise enjoy all the freedoms allotted to men. So you have this rebellion fomenting, and there are trials and inquisitions and executions. And then the Black Death hit, and with half the population gone, the power balance shifted to the workers. It wasn't just serfs, but the day laborers in the cities. They refused to work until they had higher wages, and they demanded a 5-day work week. Fucking good for them. That's where we got it.
Yeah. So they went to war, with local lords having to put down rebellions, and every time concessions were made. And by the end of the 14th century, the proletariat was in charge. They were making 6 times the wages of their predecessors, with more days off and far more protections from their bosses, and serfdom had all but vanished as an economic system. So when the plague hit and it decimated the population, there was a labor shortage, and that allowed the proletariat to really bargain with their labor. And because they had this solidarity, they were able to do it. But these rebellions, like, there would be fights. Like, a lord would have a certain area and he would like fight against the peasantry, and they would fight back. And it just became impossible, untenable to control without making concessions. So, yeah.
I mean, they did the math, and they counted, and they said there's a lot more of us than there are them. And if we don't do this, nothing gets done. And power to them.
Yeah. But this empowerment was immediately met with a counter-revolution, and the first targets were proletariat women. This was an effort by authorities to align themselves with the young men of the proletariat. And the first thing they did, and this is according to Caliban and the Witch, I've done some research around this and we're going to talk about it. The first thing they did was practically decriminalize rape if it was done to a poor woman. Rape and gang rape were common, with poor women being pulled from their homes and dragged in the streets and assaulted by 2 to 20 men at a time, with all of them getting a slap on the wrist. So what had happened was, rape used to have very serious consequences, like castration, hanging, execution. That made juries were all male. So women could testify on their own behalf. They could make a complaint on their own behalf. Their father didn't have to make it. That's a myth. Right. Okay. But juries were reluctant to pass that sentence on to another man. Okay. So then what happens is, as we've changed to like a money system, there's like jail time or a fine. And jail time meant time in the workhouse, which meant free labor. So the serious crimes were homicide and theft of property.
Okay.
Sexual assault was not seen as like a big deal crime, but it became a crime where you would either get thrown in jail for a few days or like have to pay a fine. It basically made it so that like there was just no real incentive to prosecute it. It removed the consequences.
This created solidarity of lower class men who suffered from delayed marriage. They could take revenge on their own with the state government backing them, the rapes being meted out to the women as a punishment for their independence. This served to fracture the worker solidarity that had gotten them this far. The cost for women was inestimable. Once raped, they had to leave town or turn to sex work to survive. The state sanctioned terrorism of women, specifically proletariat women, would normalize the brutality done to these same women during the witch hunts.
Now that we've laid the groundwork for what the world looked like before the plague and the witch hunts, we can get into exactly what tornado events came together to create the largest instance of femicide in history.
So the authorities changed the law so the young men of the proletariat would serve them better, basically?
When you say conspiracy, it doesn't necessarily have to be a explicit conspiracy, but because it had become a money exchange system, that changed the legal system.
Okay.
Which made that instead of punishment for crimes being like mutilation, shit like that, right? It became like fines and then time confined to the workhouses. And if you were confined to the workhouse, I mean, that benefited the authority because that you were doing that work farm labor for them.
Right.
If you could pay a fine, same difference. And so what it did is it turned the punishment for rape into what was effectively a slap on the wrist.
Yeah.
Which meant that more people engaged in it, and that because women were moving into cities and being independent and all of this kind of stuff, there was a class of men that didn't have partners. Right. And it was basically like the state like looking the other way because it didn't really, well, it actually benefited them.
Got it.
For women there was actually a benefit to them for women to be gotten rid of, to be victimized. Yeah.
During these labor outbreaks, many communities became self-sufficient, and it was merchants and other members of the bourgeoisie that lamented the lack of spending. The middle class, instead of siding with the workers, voluntarily sided with the ruling class, helping their armies to put down these working class utopias. While the feudal system of accumulating wealth no longer existed, there had to be an alternative. The working class had come up with a beautiful egalitarian one, so the ruling class decided to destroy it, giving birth to the capitalism we know today.
So basically this came down to this sort of middle class of people, right? Siding with the lords of the manor instead of with the workers. So basically when there would be like a labor strike, peasants were fine. They could all work their own land. They had interdependent relationships. Like they were good to go. And because so many were now involved in heretic religions, right? Like you couldn't guilt them into submission or abeyance, right? It was becoming more difficult. So they would be fine. Whereas when the Lord's going to war, he doesn't have anyone working it while he's doing that. So it's like, and he doesn't, where's he going to get his army from? And that's when they started tapping the bourgeoisie, and they aligned themselves with the lords of the manor. You know, it was like a critical decision, and that's the one that was made.
You still see it today with people voting against their own interests because they hope to aspire to be the people who are holding them down economically.
With things turning out as they did, the ruling class and the middle class had joined forces. And while battles kept down the formation of these egalitarian agrarian communities, they didn't solve the problem of accumulation. And so began the process of colonization and land privatization. In the Americas, the indigenous peoples were genocided in the pursuit of resource extraction, and on the horizon was the slave trade. In the Americas, indentured servants were already being sent to work in debt bondage. So basically, we've run out of land. We must find a way to expand the land. Let's see what's going on in other places. Let's start doing that, right? And let's start privatizing the lands that we do have. Let's just completely get rid of any kind of renting, right? That's what's happening. No more renting the land in exchange. Like you just got to come work the thing and I give you a wage. And then if you find a way to buy land later, that's on you, buddy.
Yeah.
Okay.
So speaking to the privatization of lands, much of the working class relied on commons areas of lands where people could gather, hunt, and subsist when they didn't own land. These were essential to feudalism. However, landlords started to enclose these spaces, kicking out the peasants that lived there. These peasants were forced to become beggars and vagrants. New vagrancy laws put these people into workhouses, which predated prisons. With the land enclosed, people were hired to farm it without any subsistence benefit, which separated the worker from his work. Agriculture was now shipped all over the world instead of being used for the benefit of the immediate population.
The biggest effect of this was social. These were the places the workers commiserated and organized. It was where women held sway and created community. It rotted the resistance from the inside out. Workers were now competing with each other at jobs on these massive farms. Old women were put out and had to join the poor rolls. Young men joined the itinerant farm workers or became criminals. Many were forced to accept horrible wages for their labor, and laws allowed for workers that left employment with prison and workhouse labor. Women that didn't get put into workhouses were exposed to male violence by joining the vagabond groups.
Women had less access to paying labor. Reproductive labor still paid outside of the home, but meager wages. So while all the workers were dispossessed by wage labor as opposed to subsistence labor, they had less access to paid jobs. Because reproductive labor in the home was no longer valued because it didn't result in a wage, this also disadvantaged women in interpersonal and social settings. It made them increasingly dependent on men for survival. And as soon as the land had been privatized, the prices of food, which had been stagnant for 200 years, started to rise. Real quick, reproductive labor is still paid outside of the home, but meager wages. What would that labor be? Outside
Nursemaid,
of the home?
wet nurse.
Okay, right.
Wet nurse, midwife.
I was thinking midwives, but I wasn't sure how common.
Yeah, wet nurse, midwife, and then I think just other things associated, like child rearing, nannying, stuff like that. So from Caliban and the Witch. If they functioned as price-regulating devices capable of turning even wheat into a precious commodity, this was because they were planted into a developing capitalist world in which a growing percentage of the population had no access to land and had to buy the food that they had once produced. And because the ruling class had learned to use the magical power of money to cut labor costs. In other words, prices rose because of the development of a national and international market system, encouraging the export and import of agricultural products, and because merchants hoarded goods to sell them later at a higher price. In September 1565 in Antwerp, there's a quote, "While the poor were literally starving in the streets, a warehouse collapsed under the weight of the grain stored in it." So basically it had created a market and a marketplace that could be now manipulated. Like
right.
once labor was money and not subsistence, money could be manipulated on something called a market, which is like what was basically developing. And so as they privatize lands, and you're the further you get distanced from the product of your labor, right? Like the easier it is to have interventions come between you. And so that's basically what was happening.
And we'll eventually see, people starving. I mean, we're already seeing people starving with food, ample food available. All of Europe was now something like a concentration camp, with masses of people starving and begging for food, and roving bands of vagrants that would loot houses and set them on fire. New laws were enacted to enslave and execute these people, but it did little to stave the rising that was happening across Europe. There were constant uprisings across the continent. In pursuit of social discipline, this is from Caliban and the Witch. In pursuit of social discipline, an attack was launched against all forms of collective sociality and sexuality, including sports, games, dances, ale wakes, festivals, and other group rituals that had been a source of bonding and solidarity for workers.
At the same time, the first public assistance programs were put into effect, which may be seen as a humanitarian reaction to a crisis, but can also be seen as the ruling class redefining its role as the boss. They're to regulate and take care of the community as the ones in charge. It was also an admission of the unsustainability of capitalism. It had managed to overturn everything in the span of a few decades. It was during these interventions that a census began to be taken, accounting for poverty, morbidity, and number of children. The government was basically taking responsibility for workers, which allowed their bosses and landlords to wash their hands of them. So now it's creating even more distance, whereas before the lords are meting out justice, that they're personally responsible for the working conditions, etc. And now it's like a state has formed that is now a higher authority, and it like regulates those things. So that now we've got the catch-all that's going to be the welfare system for these refugees of capitalism, which is a great way to think of unhoused neighbors and other people, is to think of them as refugees of capitalism, essentially.
Yeah, that's a very apt way of putting it.
Yeah.
Further complicating matters was a population decline. The colonization of the Americas had resulted in the decline of the native population by 95%, vastly declining the amount of slave labor that could be extracted from these new colonies. As well, in Europe, the birth rate had been declining. The Black Death had been hard on the population, but for a capitalist society trying to accumulate labor, the dying off of their free labor put their project in peril. The working class in Europe were refusing to make babies, and many more were giving up their children, which was a new phenomenon. So the state started to impose sanctions around women's sexuality, expressly dealing with their reproductive status.
Does any of this feel familiar? Because we're going through a population.
Texas.
Well, when people we're going through a population decline, women are refusing or deciding to be child-free. Couples are deciding to be child-free, and suddenly Roe versus Wade is overturned, and now abortions are getting harder to get unless you're basically in a coastal state. So you might see a pattern.
Yeah.
You might see a pattern as this starts to lay itself out.
Yeah, I certainly do. It's horrifying and awful, and I don't like it at all.
Yeah. New sanctions were imposed for abortion or infanticide, requiring women to register every pregnancy. If the child died before baptism, the woman would be executed. More women were executed for infanticide than any other crime in the 16th and 17th century, except for witchcraft.
What is it today? Do you know? Do you know what?
Leading cause of death in women? Well, in pregnant women, it's their partner.
It's their
murder.
partner. I think
it's murder.
I think it's heart disease now, just kind of across the board. But just in case it's been a while since you've heard the statistic, the leading cause of death in pregnant women is partner violence. I don't want you to have a single day of your life where you forget that, because I certainly don't.
So, in a quote from Caliban. Significantly, in the case of both infanticide and witchcraft, the statutes limiting women's legal responsibility were lifted. So you were nothing and untrustworthy unless they were going to pull you in and accuse you of witchcraft or infanticide, in which case you could speak in a court. Theoretically, you could speak.
You don't have a voice unless it's to incriminate yourself, and anything you say is going to do that.
Thus, women walked for the first time into the courtrooms of Europe in their own name as legal adults, under the charge of being witches and children murderers. Also, the suspicion under which midwives came in the period led to the entrance of the male doctor into the delivery room, stemmed more from the authorities' fear of infanticide than from any concern with the midwives' alleged medical incompetence, unquote.
The introduction of the male doctor into the delivery room created the first fracture. It destabilized the community of women that had surrounded childbirth. For the first time, the life of the fetus was prioritized over that of the mother. Midwives in towns were expected to police women, to note if they saw male visitors, to see who was lactating, to see who might have secretly given birth. I am going to pause the discussion because that is the fear that I have today when I go to my doctor as a childbearing age woman living in Texas. I don't tell them when my last period was. I just say, I don't know, but it's regular. I am so afraid that we're going to get to a point where my doctors could be subpoenaed for that information. Yeah. And it scares me. It legitimately scares me today.
Yeah. It's frightening that it's happening.
Yeah.
Vote. Okay. Up until this point, women had been left to their own devices in terms of birth control. Through the use of herbs and other practices, they had bodily autonomy. The stripping of this autonomy was critical to the development of capitalism. It forced women to reproduce more workers while simultaneously stripping them of any rights or agency. This was furthered by women's labor being redefined as non-work. Thus, By the end of the 17th century, women were seen as non-workers whose sole purpose was to create children for the state.
So this is a 17th century idea, not something that simply always has been since we lived in caves.
Yeah.
As certain groups online like to claim.
Yeah.
With women's work completely devalued, there was little women could do to sustain themselves if they didn't want to marry, and sex work grew exponentially. We see this still today when sex workers are told to get quote-unquote real jobs. Whereas before, there had been state-sponsored brothels. Once large swaths of women were choosing to engage in sex work rather than marriage and child-rearing, laws were quickly passed to criminalize prostitution and shut down brothels.
So, yeah, this whole sex work thing is directly tied to the desire to not have women be financially independent. That is why sex work is morally looked at as morally like a bad moral institution, when the reason that it's been deemed immoral and the reason that it has been made illegal is because it is a direct route for women to rebalance the economic inequality that the complete devaluing of their reproductive labor created. So basically, all of this is started basically in the 1600s, and it started because of capitalism. So the war against women started in the late 15th century with craft workers fighting to exclude women from their guilds because merchants were hiring them at far smaller wages. This presaged large-scale male protestation at women being allowed to work. The ruling class saw this was to their benefit and imposed laws to enforce these social bans.
From the book. According to this new social sexual contract, proletarian women became, for male workers, the substitute for the land lost to the enclosures, their most basic means of reproduction, and a communal good anyone could appropriate and use at will. But in the new organization of work, every woman became a communal good, for once women's activities were defined as non-work, women's labor began to appear as a natural resource available to all, no less than the air we breathe or the water we drink. This devaluation of women was carried through the 16th and 17th centuries, paving the way for the witch hunts. The brutalization of women was seen as necessary.
I mean, let's talk about that for a minute. So Silvia Federici is the woman that wrote the book, Caliban and the Witch, a very respected scholar. She is a philosopher. She is not a historian. So I wanted to use the direct quote because I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. I think it is very much like a philosophical take on what enabled this. I tend to be a little more practically minded. I think the devaluation of female labor made it invisible. Yes. But I don't think that men were literally thinking of them as like replacements for land acreage. You know what I mean?
Either.
Like,
and I don't really see men seeing as women as a communal good except when they're raping them. Like,
right.
Women, like a wife was, I imagine, was very much considered their property, not a communal good, not something that they would, consider like that.
Yeah.
But,
so like, I mean, because it also kind of creates like this idea that men are incapable of extending empathy or whatever. And it's like, I think it was like Thomas Law, who was like a big like misogynist, like in the 1600s or maybe the 1400s, I forget. But like he went out of his way to tutor his daughter, and she could like read and write and like spoke a bunch of languages because that was his little girl. That was his baby, right? So this idea that like people just stopped giving about each other. No, I think that when someone's daughter was raped, that it impacted the entire family, and it was, was horrible. And so I think maybe that's a little too cold. Like people don't work like that. But I do see how. That's why I say this is not like a conspiracy. Like people, like in some instances, we're going to see throughout this episode, it was very explicit. In some instances, the conspiracy was very explicit between the church and the ruling class to affect very specific ends. But for most people, they were very unwitting participants in a conspiracy, right? So this, like, the birth of capitalism, it evolved naturally in the sense that if we think of power not as a thing that exists, but as a dynamic event, as like a site of struggle, right? And so that power is power looks like a statue, but it operates more like a fountain. Right?
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
it's
yes,
like,
yes.
okay. And so what happened was the workers united and created this solution, and the ruling class had their solution, and that middle class made a vote and decided to assist the ruling class. So then with that power restored into balance, capitalism was kind of the only thing that could emerge at that point. So in that sense, capitalism is natural, because if you look at evolution of society as these constant sites of struggle, power like running through it constantly, then you can see that it's not necessarily a conspiracy, because there was a kind of only one way for it to have evolved at that point. When that power struggle there was lost, then what could proceed from it was kind of set in stone for a while. And as we're experiencing now, like as we're going through climate change and other things, and after World War II, there was like the Human Rights Accord and all of this stuff where we decided conquest was over. So you could no longer like invade another country to like take that land, right? And so that as a means of expanding power like was no longer available, and everyone kind of agreed to that.
Yeah.
Right. That was like another big shift where we went, okay, like moving forward, we're like, it's like it can only operate this way now.
Yeah.
Right. And then, so does that make sense? That's my big theory. Okay. So the first phase of this was legally stripping women of rights. They were declared legal imbeciles and could not fight for themselves in court. They were not allowed to live alone or with other women or their own families if widowed, because it was considered that they wouldn't be controlled by anyone. She wouldn't have a chaperone. Women were forbidden from being alone on the streets, from sitting in front of their houses or in the windows, or having female friends. So basically that kind of like, you can't leave the house without a chaperone. You can't be the head of a household. Like men have to dictate literally every aspect of your life and have to be watching over like every aspect of what you do. Now, this again, she is a philosopher. There was conflicts. There were places where this was happening more rapidly and places where it was not. The witch hunts never really took hold in Italy. Italians just thought it was the silliest thing they'd ever heard. And like, so you have to bear in mind that like, this wasn't true everywhere all the time. It's not like everyone on the same day in Europe, like sat down and like, let's write a law to limit women's whatever. That's not like, this was a very slow process, right? That had to do with like, like epistemic differences, like epistemic evolutions in like how we thought of people.
Right. And this is the kind of thing that can't happen. It can happen all at once, but it's much smoother if it happens gradually, because you don't question small changes the way you would one huge change.
Yeah. So women were vilified as inferior to men and unable to govern themselves. These ideas were followed in law by the witch hunts, by the act of terrorism. Women that were disobedient were subject to rape, torture, and execution.
There was also a paradigm shift going on in the background of these changes, the way the body was viewed and the belief in magic. Quote from the book: "Eradication of these practices was a necessary condition for the capitalist rationalization of work, since magic appeared as an illicit form of power and instrument to obtain what one wanted without work, that is, a refusal of work and action." Quote, "Magic kills industry," lamented Francis Bacon, admitting that nothing repelled him so much as the assumption that one could obtain results with a few idle expedients rather than with the sweat of one's brow.
So I thought this was fascinating, because it's like, why did the witch hunts happen? How did everyone suddenly believe in this thing called a witch? And so this was to me like kind of the most interesting section of her book, where she's talking about magic and the body. And
Okay.
Magic, moreover, rested upon a qualitative conception of space and time that precluded a regulation of the labor process. How could the new entrepreneurs impose regular work patterns on a proletariat anchored in the belief that there are lucky and unlucky days? That is, days on which one can travel and others on which one should not move from home. Days on which to marry and others on which every enterprise should be cautiously avoided.
Equally incompatible with the capitalist work discipline was a conception of the cosmos that attributed special power to the individual. The magnetic look, the power to make oneself invisible, to leave one's body, to change the will of others by magical incantation. The incompatibility of magic with the capitalist work discipline and the requirement of social control is one of the reasons why a campaign of terror was launched against it by the state. A terror applauded without reservation by many who are presently considered among the founders of scientific rationalism. Jean Bodin, the mechanical philosopher and member of the Royal Society, Richard Boyle, and Newton's teacher, Isaac Barrow.
So I just think this is really fascinating because it had this has been true since slave rebellions, because if people believe that their side is imbued with magic, it gives them a kind of control, right? Mm-hmm. So if you convince them that magic is the work of the devil, it's like you're taking away their last spiritual defense against conquest. Right. Which is why natives weren't allowed to practice their traditions until the 70s or the 90s. I think the first powwow that really happened was in the early 60s and it was a form of rebellion because and it goes back to Sitting Bull and the ghost dance, where he had a vision that if everyone started doing this ghost dance that they would I forget what the exact thing was, but it was going to empower them to defeat the whites. Right. And so they banned the ghost dance. Ain't nobody, if we catch you doing the ghost dance, straight to jail. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's really, I thought this was really particularly interesting that part of how the witch hunt was going to operate was they had to invert how people felt about magic.
Wow.
Right. Because before this time, magic was not viewed as nefarious. It just existed like other things, like the air or the sea. Magic is just something that exists and some people are able to use it. Right. So even the materialist Hobbes, while keeping his distance, gave his approval. Quote, "As for witches," he wrote, "I think not that their witchcraft is any real power, but yet that they are justly punished for the false belief they have that they can do such mischief, joined with their purpose to do it if they can." So just even thinking that you
That's a thought crime.
Yeah, thought crime.
Yeah. Okay.
So the alienation of the body led to the first biohacking. This is early.
Oh, shit.
So capitalism, biohacking, weird accumulation, all these things. This is a pattern. This is a pattern. So tech takes over. Tech goes from being evil to being your best friend. Now we're trying to change the system into this cryptocurrency. You've got, and then this sort of biohacking of ultimate productivity. These are all part and parcel. These things are actually as old as the 1600s. So the alienation of the body led to the first biohacking by making the body nothing but a machine in need of the right inputs. They were creating a worker class for capitalism. Okay, now enter the Black Death, which we will get into next week.
Oof. This is so good. This is such a good history lesson before the big show.
So you can keep all this in mind, because for me, my biggest question about the witch trials was why then? And what enabled people to be so okay with this? What I knew about the witch trials was that they happened, but one day someone decided to burn a witch. Why? Why then? If witches have always existed, then why wasn't the first witch burning at the beginning of time? Why did it happen right at this time? This book provides a pretty convincing argument that it wasn't a perfect explicit conspiracy, but it was definitely a tornado of events coming together at the same time that created the perfect storm for this huge femicide event. They're still fighting about how many people they think were killed during this Some estimates are in the millions. Other more conservative estimates are in like the hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands. If you look at population differences and the population decline after the Black Death, I think it's probably more like it was in the hundreds of thousands, but by today's population standards, it would have been in the millions.
Right.
Because you have to
percentage
kind
of the global population.
Yes. And just a side note, I'm deliberately not addressing witchcraft in the New World or in places outside of Europe. But it's important to note that witch hunting is not the direct domain of Christianity or European society. All societies have an idea of a witch, and witch hunts have taken place and continue to this day to exist. They happen I think in certain places in Africa during civil wars and conflicts. You saw it in Haiti. That magic and witchcraft and witch hunts are an anthropological phenomenon. We all seem to do it in some way or another. So, that's the other thing that we're going to get into next week. We're going to look at how witch hunts are a social phenomenon and never stopped. They just weren't maybe at scale.
This is fantastic. I loved this. Thank you for putting this together for us and sharing your knowledge.
Yes. Okay.
Housekeeping?
Yes. We have a Patreon, patreon.com/illrepute. We have the $5 tier right now. That's what we got, but you get show notes. We're working on access to a Discord, and you get bonus episodes, at least one each month. We just put our first one out. And yeah, as we get our workflow more together, more coherent, we will be building out more tiers for more fun. Show notes will have links to all the sources, and we'll also have links to all of our socials if you want to follow us on stuff. Please rate the podcast. Give us 5 stars. Like it. If you're not subscribed, subscribe. All of that really helps with getting us on the charts, which in the exchange gets us a wider audience. And tell your friends. If you love the show, tell your friends. That is the quickest way to help us grow, especially, and this will always stay free. The Patreon is more like, think of it as a tip jar for the moment, but you're not losing anything. We just stay and listen. If you're not in a position to throw a $5 in the tip jar, tell 5 of your friends.
And you can find all of our links on our Linktree. It's linktree/illreputepod, all lowercase, so linktr.ee/illreputepod. You can find us all over the place.
Yes.
And I love you. And you're beautiful. And you're very intelligent. And I love our time together. And I hope our listeners do too.
Aww.